What's up guys, welcome back to another Q&A. First thing first, I want to say sorry for all of you who follow me on the YouTube and wait for my video to upload on the Saturday or the Sunday. I didn't able to upload the video on the YouTube on the last Saturday or Sunday because I was in Uttarakhand. I was enjoying the greenery and was enjoying the fresh air and the beautiful Osprana there. So I just want to say sorry for all of you who follow me on the YouTube and wanted to watch my video on the Saturday or the Sunday. So now coming back to our topic, today we will discuss about the Q&A on the time of supply of goods or services. You might be thinking that what exactly is the time of supply of goods or services, or why do we need to understand the time of supply of goods or services? So the time of supply of goods or services is very important for the two reasons. First of all, you have to make the payment under GST on the basis of the time of supply of goods or services. And for the second reason is that suppose there is a change in the tax rate of the GST, then the time of supply of goods or services will be very important for determining that which type or which tax rate you have to pay in case there is a change in the tax rate of the GST. So for the first reason why we need to understand the time of supply of services, because look, you have to make the payment under GST on the monthly basis, and the due date of making the payment under GST is the 20th day of the following month. So for making the payment, first of all you have to add up all the supply of goods or services made during that month, and for adding up all the supply of goods or services during that month, you first have to understand that when the time or when the supply of goods or services has actually happened. So you have to first get the idea that when the supply of goods or services has actually happened. So you have to first get the idea that when the supply of goods or services has happened, and the answer of this question will be done by way of understanding the topic time of supply of goods or services. So when you understand the time of supply of goods or services, you will get the answer to the question that when we can say that the time of supply of goods or services has happened. So when you get the answer that when the time of supply of goods or services has happened, then you have to add up all the supply of goods or services during that month, and then you have to make the payment on the 20th day of the following month in which your time of supply of goods or services has actually happened. And for the second reason why we need to understand the time of supply of goods or services, because in case of a change in the rate of tax under GST. So suppose the change in the rate of tax under GST has happened with effect from the 10th August 2017. So if the time of supply of goods or services will be 8th August 2017, then you have to pay the tax at the rate of the previous tax rate. And suppose if the time of supply of goods or services at that particular supply will be after 10th August 2017, then you have to pay the tax under the new tax rate which is applicable on you. So therefore we need to understand the time of supply of goods or services, because it is very critical for paying the tax, and it is also very critical for determining that which tax rate you need to pay to the government in case there is a change in the rate of tax under the GST. So in a nutshell, we have to look at the meaning, or we have to understand the topic of the time of supply of goods or services under GST. So in this Q&A we will take the answer, or we will take the question of the following things. So the first thing is like, what exactly will be the time of supply of goods or services under GST? We will take the Q&A on what exactly will be the time of supply of goods or services. Under GST, the time of supply of goods and of services is different. So the time of supply of goods is different, and the time of supply of services is also different. So we will understand that what will be the time of supply of goods and what will be the time of supply of goods, what will be the time of supply of service will be under GST. So we will first take the Q&A on this, and then we will take the Q&A on what exactly will be the time of supply of goods or services in case of a reverse charge. So if you are under the reverse charge, then that is also a practical aspect, that what will be the time of supply of goods or services in case of a reverse charge. There will be a different provision, and there is a different provision under GST which deals with the time of supply of goods or services in case you fall under the reverse charge compulsion. And then we will take the Q&A on what exactly will be the time of supply in case of change in rate of tax. So if there is a change in the rate of tax under GST, then how you can determine the time of supply of goods or services and under which type of a rate you have to pay the tax under GST. We will discuss about this topic in this series, in this Q&A. And the last one is that we will take the Q&A, we will take the example, practical example of the time of supply of goods or services. So this is also a very interesting and important topic for understanding by you. So stay tuned and watch my full video till the end so that you can get the idea of the time of supply of goods or services. And for your record, I have also discussed about the time of supply of goods or services in my another video. I have covered in detail there. There will be a link in the description about the time of supply of goods or services, which I have covered in the previous or the separate video. Go check out the video if you want to know the legal provision relating to the time of supply of goods or services. In this video we will take the Q&A, only the question and answer of the time of supply of goods or services. And if you want to know the legal provision, then check out my other video. I have covered in detail about the time of supply of goods or services there. So just for the record, that was the thing. So stay tuned and watch the full video, and with this we start the session, and let's start. So this is our first question of this Q&A, and the question is relating to the practical example of the time of supply of goods or services. And the question is, we didn't get that why the time of supply of goods or services is important to understand. Can you make us understand by giving an example? So you get the theoretical knowledge of why the time of supply of goods or services is important to understand. You got the point, you appreciate it, and you understand it theoretically. But now you want to ask me that what exactly will be the practical example of why the time of supply of goods or services is important to understand. So let me give you an example of why you need to understand the time of supply of goods or services under GST. And just like we have talked in the previous question, that the time of supply of goods or services is important to understand for the two reasons. First of all, you have to make the payment under GST on the basis of time of supply of goods or services. And for the second reason is that if there is a change in the tax rate under GST, then you have to also need the knowledge of the time of supply of goods or services under GST. So let me give you a practical example on both the importance. So in the first one is that when there will be, you want to pay the tax under GST, you want to pay the tax under GST. So suppose you want to pay the tax under GST for the month of July. So you have to first make up your mind that the due date of making the payment under GST is the 20th day of the following month. So suppose you want to pay the tax for the month of July, then the due date for paying the tax under GST is the 20th August 2017. So make up into your mind that the due date is the 20th August 2017 for the month of the July. So suppose you want to pay the tax for the month of July, and your time of supply of that particular goods or services is 29th July 2017. So if the time of supply of that particular goods or services is 29th July 2017, then you have to pay the tax in respect of those supply of goods or services by 20th August 2017. So you have to pay the tax if your time of supply of that particular goods or services is 29th July 2017, then you have to pay the tax up to 20th August 2017. But if the time of supply of that particular goods or services will be 8th August 2017, then you have to pay the tax by 20th September 2017, because at that time your time of supply of goods or services has been shifted to the next month, and then you have to pay the tax on the 20th day of the next month, which will be 20th September 2017. So look at the practical example. So in case suppose your time of supply of goods or services is 8th August 2017 and you misunderstood the concept, or you didn't know the concept, and you suppose that you understood or you mistakenly think that the time of supply of goods or services is 29th July 2017, then in this case you might have already paid the tax by 20th August 2017. So but in actual you have to pay the tax up to 20th September 2017. So by making the payment earlier, you have also missed your opportunity cost interest, which you can earn by way of giving that money into the fixed deposit or other kind of stuff. Or if you are using the working capital, then also you can save the interest cost there. So it means that if you didn't get the meaning or didn't understand the topic of time of supply of goods or services, you might be ended up paying the tax earlier than you have to actually paid it. So in this case, suppose the time of supply of goods or services was 8th August, you might have paid the tax by 20th August, which means that you have missed the opportunity cost of that fund and you paid the tax earlier. And in the opposite way, suppose the time of supply of goods or services was 29 July 2017 and you mistakenly thought that the time of supply of goods or services is 8th August 2017, then in this case, if the department will catch you, then he will also charge the interest on the delay payment of taxes. So make sure that you correctly determine the time of supply of goods or services so that you can save the opportunity cost, or you can also save the interest on the delay payment of taxes if the government catch you by way of audit or by way of another means. So you have to get the correct meaning or the correct understanding of the time of supply of goods or services for making the payment under GST. So that was our first practical example if you want to pay the tax under GST. And in the second importance case where there will be a change in the effective rate of tax, now I am going to tell you that why it is important to understand that the time of supply of goods or services. So if suppose the tax rate under GST has been changed from 12% to 18%. The tax rate under GST has been changed from 12% to 18% on that particular goods or services with effect from the 8th August 2017. So the tax rate has been changed from 12% to 18% with effect from the 8th August 2017. So if suppose the time of supply of that particular goods or services is 7th August 2017, then you have to pay the tax at the rate of 12%. That is the rate of tax which was before the changes. And if the time of supply of goods or services is 9th August 2017, then you have to pay the tax at the rate of the 18%, which is the new tax rate. So you have to make sure that you understand the concept of time of supply of goods or services so that you can pay the actual rate of taxes. So in case your rate of tax is 12% and you paid by mistakenly 18%, then that is a very big margin and you ended up paying the extra taxes. And suppose you paid the 12% instead of 18%, then also there is a problem. You can get the penalty or the tax interest in case the government catch you. So in a nutshell, there is a very important that you get the correct meaning and the understanding of the time of supply of goods or services if you are making the payment for the GST and if there is a change of the tax rate under GST. The next question is very important for this video, and it says that what is the time of supply of goods under GST? So the time of supply of goods under GST is given under section 12, and section 12 says that the liability to pay tax under GST in respect of the goods shall be at the time of supply of goods, and the time of supply of goods shall be the earlier of the following event. So the time of supply of goods will be the earlier of the following event. So the first event is the date of issue of invoice by the supplier, and the second event is the date on which the supplier receive the payment with respect to those supplies. So the time of supply of goods. The time of supply of goods, not the service, but the goods. So the time of supply of goods shall be the earlier of the two events. First event is that when the supplier issue the invoice in respect of such supply, and the second event is the date on which the supplier received the payment in respect of those supplies. So whichever event is the earlier out of those two events will be the time of supply of goods under GST. The previous question was about the time of supply of goods, and this question is about the time of supply of service. And the question is, what is the time of supply of service under GST? The time of supply of service under GST is given under section 13, and that section says that the time of supply of service will be following. There is a two circumstances, there is a two situation in which the time of supply of services will be dealing. The first situation is when the invoice is issued within the time prescribed under section 32 subsection 2. So if the invoice is issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, then you have to follow this rule or this section. And if the invoice is not issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, then you have to follow this situation. So there are two situations. First situation is when the invoice is issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, then you have to follow these conditions. And if the invoice is not issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, then you have to follow this condition. So in the first situation, when the invoice is issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, then the time of supply of service, not the goods, the time of supply of services will be the earlier of the following: the date of issue of invoice or the date of receipt of payment by the supplier. So the time of supply of service will be earlier of the date of issue of invoice or the date of receipt of payment by the supplier. So the time of supply of service will be earlier of the following two in case the invoice is issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2. And if the invoice is not issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, then the time of supply of service will be the earlier of the following two. The first event is the date of provision of service, and the second event is the date of receipt of payment by the supplier. So if the invoice is not issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, then the time of supply of service will be the earlier of the date of provision of service or the date of receipt of payment by the supplier. Now the question is, what is the time limit within which the invoice need to be issued by the supplier? The time within which the invoice need to be issued by the supplier is given under section 31 subsection 2, and the time of issue of invoice of service is before or after the provision of service. The time limit within which the invoice is to be issued is before or after the provision of service, but within the time prescribed under rule. So you have to issue invoice either before the provision of service, and if you are issuing the invoice after the provision of service, then you have to issue the invoice within the 30 days from the date of supply of service, and that is provided under the invoicing rule. So you can issue either the invoice before the provision of service, and if you are opting to issue the invoice after the provision of service, then it should be within the time prescribed under the rule. And the time prescribed under the rule is that the time is 30 days from the date of supply of service. So if you mix the act and the rule, if you mix section 31 subsection 2 and the rule, the time of issue of invoice in case of a service is before the provision of service and within the 30 days of the provision or the supply of service. So if you issued the invoice within the 30 days of the supply of service, then the time of supply of service will be the earlier of the date of issue of invoice or the date of receipt of payment. And in case you have not issued the invoice within the 30 days of the supply of service, then the the time of supply of service will be the earlier of the date of provision of service and the date of receipt of payment. So because when you didn't issue the invoice within the 30 days of supply of service, it means that the law will say that you have to follow the provision of service, because you delayed the issuance of invoice. So the law will say that if you delay the issue of invoice, then we will consider the time of supply of service as the date of provision of service. So therefore it is two condition here. First one deal with the time supply service in case you issue the invoice within the time limit. If you not issue the invoice within the time limit, then the time of supply service will be the provision of service or a date of receipt of payment. So that is exactly why the two situation is there, because if you delay the issue of invoice, then it means that you can also delay the time of supply of service, which in turn will delay the making of payment. So the law has plug in that loophole, or the law has plug in that that practices that you can delay the invoice. So therefore the law take care of such situation in which the person can delay the issue of invoice and can delay the payment of tax to the government. So therefore the government has said that if you delay the issue of invoice, then we will take the time of supply of service as the date of provision of service or the time of supply or the receipt of payment. So therefore the situation, this section says about the two situation. First one is when you issue the invoice within the time, and the second one is when you issue the invoice after or not issue the invoice within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2. Let me just give you an example of how to determine the time of supply of services under GST. So suppose we take an example, and in the example the date of provision of service is 8th August 2017. The date of provision of service is 8th August 2017, and the date of issue of invoice is 9th August 2017, just after the date of provision of service, and the date of receipt of payment is 15th September 2017, which is approximately 1 month after the date of provision of service. Now first we have to check out that whether the supplier of goods, whether the supplier of services has issued the invoice within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, and the time within which the invoice should be issued is within the 30 days from the date of provision of service. In this case, the date of issue of invoice is 9th August 2017, which is just the next day of the date of provision of service. So in this case, the date of issue of invoice is within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2. So we have to follow the first case. So the first case is that when the date of issue of invoice is within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, then the time of supply of service will be the earlier of the two events. The first event was the date of issue of invoice, and the second event was the date of receipt of payment. So now we have to check the earlier event out of those two events, and the earlier event is the 9th August 2017. So the time of supply of service will be the 9th August 2017, which is the date of issue of invoice. And in the second situation, we will take the second situation, and in the second situation the date of provision of service is 8 August 2017, and the date of issue of invoice is 11th September 2017, which is approximately 1 month after the date of provision of service. And the date of receipt of payment is in the first case, the date of receipt of payment is 15th September 2017. So first we have to check out that whether the invoice has been issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, and the time limit is before or after the provision of service, and the time after is within the 30 days from the date of provision service. So we have to check out that whether the invoice is issued within the 30 days of the provision of service. So if you look at the example, the date of issue of invoice is beyond or after the 30 days from the date of issue of invoice. Therefore, we have to check out, we have to follow the second situation which we have discussed in the previous question, and in this case the time of supply of service will be the earlier of the following two events. The first event was the date of provision of service, not the issue of invoice, the provision of service, and the date of receipt of payment. So in this case the date, because the invoice is issued after or the invoice is not issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, now we have to check out the earlier event out of the two events. First event is the date of provision of service or the date of issue, date of receipt of payment. We don't have to look at the date of issue of invoice in this case. So we have to check out the date of provision of service and the date of receipt of payment. So the date of provision of service is 8th August 2017 and the date of receipt of payment is 15th September 2017, and the earlier event is the date of provision of service, which is 8th August 2017. So the time of supply of service will be 8th August 2017. The next question is relating to the date of receipt of payment by the supplier, and the question is, what is the date of receipt of payment by the supplier means? So we have seen that the time of supply of goods was earlier of the following two events. First event was that when the supplier issues the invoice or when the supplier receives the payment. Whichever the earlier event will be the time of supply of service, time of supply of goods. And in case of a time of supply of service, we have to look at the earlier event of the following two. There was a two situation. First situation is when the invoice is issued within the time limit prescribed under section 31 subsection 2. In that case, the time of supply of service was the earlier of the following two events. First event is the time, the date of issue of invoice and the date of receipt of payment. So whichever event was earlier was the time of supply of service, and in case the invoice is not issued within the time prescribed under section 31 subsection 2, then the time of supply of service was the earlier of the following two events. First event was the date of provision of service and the next event was the date in which the supplier receives the payment. So in both two cases, both two situations, the time of supply of goods or the time of supply service, the one condition was that when the supplier receives the payment. But when we can say that the supplier has received the payment, whether we can say the receipt of payment when the supplier receives the check, or we have to look at the date on which the amount is entered in his books of account or the amount is credited in the bank account. Which event will be considered as the date in which the supplier receives the payment? So explanation 2 of section 12 talks about the time, the date of supply, the date of receipt of payment by the supplier. And similarly, there is also one explanation which is provided under section 13, which also deals with the date of receipt of payment by the supplier. So there are two explanations, one for the time of supply of goods and one was the time of supply of services. But the both explanation is similar. And the date of receipt of payment by the supplier of goods and the date of receipt of payment by the supplier service is the same, and that explanation is that the date of receipt of payment by the supplier will be the earlier of the two events. The date of receipt of payment by the supplier will be the earlier of the two events. So we have to look at the event first, and then whichever event will be the earlier will be considered as the date of receipt of payment by the supplier. So the first event is the date on which the payment is entered in his books of account. So when the supplier will make the entry in his books of account regarding the receipt of payment, the first event was that, and the second event is the date on which the amount is entered, the amount is credited into his bank account. So as soon as the amount will be credited in his bank account, that event will be the second event. And we have to look at the first event, we have to look at the earlier event out of those two events. So the time, the date of receipt of payment by the supplier will be accordingly. So first event was that when the supplier entered in his books of account the amount. So how we can say, when we can say that the amount is entered in his books of account, so when he makes the entry in his books of account, and the entry will be like bank account debit to the supplier, bank account debit, and the supplier account will be credited, or the debtor's account will be credited. So when he makes the entry in his books of account regarding the receipt of payment, the first event is that, and the second event is when the amount will be credited into his bank account. So as soon as he receives the amount into his bank account, so like you can check out the passbook, or you can check out electronically by way of internet banking that whether the amount has been credited into the bank account, and if yes, the second event will be fulfilled. And we have to take the earlier event after those two events, and whichever event will be earlier will be considered as the date of receipt of payment by the supplier. The next question is relating to the advance receipt of payment by the supplier, and the question is, what will be the time of supply of goods or services in case of advance receipt by the supplier? So suppose you are a supplier and you issued the invoice of 1000 rupees, but the recipient of supply of goods or services paid you 1500 rupees. It means that they had the recipient of goods or services paid you in advance up to rupees 500 rupees, because you issued the invoice of 1000 rupees and he paid back 1500 rupees. So he paid the advance of 500 rupees to the supplier of goods or services. Now the question is whether the 500 rupees, which is the excess of the issue of invoice, will be treated differently than the normal provision. The normal provision is that in case of a supply of goods, the normal provision is that the time of supply of goods will be the earlier of the two events. First event was that when you issue the invoice, and the second event was when you receive the payment. So as per the normal provision, the time of supply of goods or services in case of the excess payment or in case of advance payment should be always the date of receipt of amount, date of receipt of payment by the supplier, because the earlier event will always be the date of receipt of payment in case of a advance payment. So whether there is any provision which deals with the advance payment, whether there is any provision which differentiate the time of supply of goods as well as of services in case the supplier received the advance. So proviso to section 12 subsection 1 and the proviso to section 13 subsection 1 deals with the advance payment in case the supplier received the advance payment of goods as well as of services. So what I will gonna tell you in this section is similar for both supplier of goods as well as for supplier of services. So whatever I will tell you about the time of supply of goods as well as for services in case the supplier received the advance payment will be just similar in both the cases of goods as well as of the services. So the proviso to section 12 subsection 1 and the proviso to section 13 subsection 1 says that if the supplier of goods or the service receive an advance payment up to 100 rupees, 1000 rupees. So if the supplier of goods or services receives an amount up to 1000 rupees in excess of the amount indicated in the invoice, so it should be, the amount should be up to only 1000 rupees and the amount is in excess of the invoice issued by the supplier. So the supplier, if the supplier issued an invoice and the recipient of supply of goods or services make you the payment, and the advance payment should be excess by only 1000 rupees. So suppose you issued an invoice of 2000 rupees and the supplier of goods or services receive the 2500 or 2500 rupees, then this proviso the advance payment, the section which I will gonna tell you will applicable, because the amount should be only up to 1000 rupees and it should be in excess of the amount indicated in the invoice. So there's two conditions. First one is that the amount of advance should be received against the invoice issued by the supplier. So first of all, the supplier of goods or services need to issue the invoice, and the advance in respect of those invoice should be up to 1000 rupees. So if suppose you receives an advance without issuing an invoice, then this section will not cover that situation, because if this section will applicable, then the applicability is that the advance payment should be in excess of the amount indicated in the invoice. The supplier should first of all issue the invoice and the amount should be received against that invoice, and the advance amount should be up to 1000 rupees. So this is the two condition which should be satisfied before we can apply this proviso. And the time of supply of that particular advance will be to the extent of such excess amount only, the amount of date of issue of invoice at the option of the supplier. So there is also condition here. First one is that the time of supply of those advances will be to the extent of such advance. So only to the extent of such advance, not the whole amount, but to the extent of such advance will be the date of issue of invoice, the date of issue of invoice, but that is at the option of the supplier. So suppose the supplier issued an invoice of 2000 rupees and the supplier receives the payment of 2500. So only to the extent of only 500 rupees, which is the advance payment, only up to the amount of 500 rupees, the time of supply of goods or services will be at the option of the supplier will be the date of issue of invoice. So it is the option, the supplier has the option to make the payment, to deem that the time of supply in respect of those advances will be the date of issue of invoice instead of date of receipt of payment. So in our example, when we issued the invoice of 2000 rupees and we received the payment up to 2500 rupees, in that case all the conditions are fulfilling. First condition is that you issued the invoice first and you received the payment up to 1000 rupees in respect of those invoice, and the amount is to the time of supply of those advances is to the extent of only 500 rupees will be the date of issue of invoice, and the supplier has the only option that he can consider the time of supply in respect of those advances will be the date of issue of invoice. So remember that is the option for the supplier, and the option is only for the advances. The word is that to the extent of such excess amount. So only to the extent of such excess amount, the time of supply of goods as well as service will be the date of issue of invoice. So in our case, only the 500 rupees, only to the extent of 500 rupees, the time of supply of goods or services is the date of receipt, the date of issue of invoice. But for 2000 rupees, for the 2000 rupees for which the supplier issued the invoice, the time of supply of goods or services will be considered normally, which will be in case of a goods the earlier of the two events. First event was when the supplier issued the invoice and the supplier received the payment. So only up to the excess amount, the time of supply of advances is the date of issue of invoice. But in case you receive the advance payment in excess of the 1000 rupees, then this provision will not be applicable to you. So the following condition is that what will be the condition before we can say that we consider the time of supply of goods or services under this section. First one is that the amount should be received up to only 1000 rupees and the supplier should issue the invoice in respect of those supply of goods or services, and it is the option of the supplier to consider the time of supply of goods or services against only those advances that the time will be the date of issue of invoice instead of date of receipt of payment, and only to the extent of such advances, the time of supply of goods or services will be the date of issue of invoice. Let me just give you an example of how the advance receipt of payment by the supplier will actually work. How the time of supply of goods as well as service in case the supplier receive advance payment up to 1000 rupees will work. So suppose you are a supplier of goods. So as per the normal provision, the time of supply of goods will be the earlier of the date of issue of invoice and the date of receipt of payment by the supplier. That is a normal provision. But the provision to section 12 subsection 1 and the proviso to section 13 subsection 1 says that the time of supply of goods in case you receive the advance payment up to 1000 rupees will be at the option of the supplier, will be the date of issue of invoice, but that invoice should be issued and the receipt of 1000 rupees should be received against that invoice. So let me just give you an example of how it will work. So suppose you are a supplier of goods and you issued the invoice of 5000 rupees and you receive the payment in respect of those invoice of 5600 rupees. So what will be the time of supply in case of that? The time of supply of that will be the time of issue of invoice, because the advance is received of 600 rupees which is up to 1000 rupees. So the time of supply of only for the 600 rupees, the time of supply of 600 rupees will be the date of issue of invoice, and that is the option. The supplier has the option to choose the date of issue of invoice at the time of supply of goods in respect of only 600 rupees, and for the rest of the 500 rupees which the supplier issued the invoice, the time of supply of goods will be as per the normal provision. So the option to choose the date of issue of invoice is only for the advance. It's only for the advance, not for the whole amount but for the advance. So for the 5000 rupees, the time of supply of goods will be as per the normal provision, but for only the 600 rupees, the time of supply of goods can be the time of issue of invoice. That is the option of the supplier. And in the second situation, the supplier issued the invoice of 5000 rupees and the supplier received the payment of 6500 rupees. The proviso will not be applicable in this case because the supplier received the payment, the supplier received the advance exceeding the 1000 rupees. So that proviso which we have discussed in this question will not be applicable because the supplier received the payment in excess of the 1000 rupees. So for the whole 6500 rupees, the time of supply of goods will be determined as per the normal provision. The advance payment rules, advance payment section, advance payment proviso will not be applicable in this situation because the supplier received the advance exceeding the amount which is indicated in the invoice and the amount is exceeding the 1000 rupees, so it will not work here. And in the third situation, like invoice is not issued but the supplier received the payment of 5000 rupees, in that case also the proviso will not be applicable because the proviso will only be applicable in case the supplier first issued the invoice. So suppose the supplier received the advance without issuing the invoice, then this proviso will not be applicable and the time of supply in respect of those advance will be the date of receipt of payment, because the date of receipt of payment will always be earlier of the date of issue of invoice in case you receive the advances. So in case you receive the advances without issuing the invoice, the time of supply of goods as well as of service will always be the time of receiving the payment by the supplier. So that is an example of how the advance received by the supplier will actually work. The next question is relating to the reverse charge. What will be the time of supply of goods in case the supplier of goods is under the reverse charge compulsion? And the question is, what is the time of supply of goods in case of tax payable under the reverse charge? So you want to ask me that when the supplier of goods, not the service but the goods, so when you are a supplier of goods and you are required to pay tax under the reverse charge mechanism, then What will be the time of supply of goods? What exactly will be the time of supply of goods in case of a reverse charge if you are supplier of goods? We will discuss right now about the goods. We will discuss about the time of supply of service in the next question. So the answer to this question is given under section 12 subsection 3. 12 subsection 3 deals with the time of supply of goods in case of a reverse charge mechanism, and the section says that the time of supply of goods if you are paying the tax under the reverse charge is the earlier of the following three events. The first event is that the date of receipts of goods. So the first event is date of receipts of goods. So when you receive the goods into your place of business or the factory, that will be the first event. Second event is the earlier of the two events, and the first event is that when you make the entry into your books of account regarding the payment made by you, and when the date on which the payment is entered, the payment is debited into your bank account. So because you are the recipient of supply of goods, because you are under the reverse charge mechanism, so you are the recipient of supply of goods and you want to make the payment to the supplier of goods. So the second event is the earlier of the two events. First event is that when you make the entry of payment into a books of account, or when the payment is reflected or the payment is debited into your bank account. So whichever event will be the earlier will be considered as the second event. And the third event is that after 30 days from the date of issue of invoice. So when the recipient of supply of goods issue the invoice, then you have to consider, you have to check out the 30 days from the date of issue of invoice. That will be the third event. So there are three events before you can say the time of supply of goods under the reverse charge mechanism. So in the reverse charge mechanism, the recipient of supply of goods or services have to make the payment to the government. In the normal provision, the supplier of goods or services need to pay the tax to the government, but in case of a reverse charge mechanism, the liability to pay tax is under the hand of the recipient of supply of goods or services. The time of supply of goods in case you are under the reverse charge mechanism is the earlier of the three events. First event is that when you receive the goods into a factory. Second event is the earlier of when you make the entry of payment in your books of account, or when the amount is debited into your bank account. And the third event is that after 30 days from the date of issue of invoice. So in the reverse charge mechanism, the recipient of supply of goods or services need to issue invoice. In the normal case, the liability to issue invoice is of recipient, but in case of a reverse charge mechanism, the issue of invoice is also the duty of the recipient of supply of goods or services. So in case you are under the reverse charge mechanism, you are the recipient of supply of goods or services also need to issue invoice if you are under the reverse charge mechanism. But there are also lot of practical aspects relating to the reverse charge mechanism, like who are the exact person who are liable to pay tax under the reverse charge mechanism. Whether the recipient of supply of goods or services who need to pay tax under the GST in case of a reverse charge mechanism can also take the input tax credit when he make the payment of tax regarding the supply of goods or services on which the reverse charge mechanism is applicable. And whether the recipient of supply of goods or services need to issue any invoice in case the recipient is under the reverse charge mechanism. And there are also a lot of practical aspects relating to the reverse charge mechanism. So if you want to know all the practical aspects relating to the reverse charge mechanism, then check out my other video about the reverse charge mechanism. I have covered in detail about each of the practical aspects in that video. Check out that video if you want to know more about the reverse charge mechanism, and the link of that video is also given down in the description. Check out the description column which is just below the video, and click on the link and you will get the answer of all the practical aspects relating to the reverse charge mechanism. In the previous question, we have discussed about the time of supply of goods in case of a reverse charge mechanism. Now in this question we will discuss about the time of supply of service, not the goods but the service, in case you are under the reverse charge mechanism. And the question is, what is the time of supply of service in case the tax is payable under the reverse charge mechanism? So in case you are under the reverse charge mechanism and you are the recipient of supply of goods or services, then you need to determine the time of supply of that services according to section 13 subsection 3. Section 13 subsection 3 deals with the time of supply of service in case you are the recipient of service and you need to pay tax under the reverse charge mechanism. And the answer is that the time of supply of service in case you are under the reverse charge mechanism is the earlier of the two events. First event is the earlier of the two events, and the first event out of that event is when you make the entry into your books of account, or when the amount is debited into your bank account. So when you make the entry into your books of account, or when the amount is debited into a bank account, you have to check out the earlier event out of those two events. And when you determine the earlier event out of those two events, that will be treated as the first event under section 13 subsection 3. And the second event which need to be determined under section 13 subsection 3 is the 60 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. So you have to calculate the 60 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. So add up the 60 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. So you have to add the 60 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. So the two events is that first event is the earlier of when the recipient of supply or service make the entry into a books of account regarding the payment, or when the amount is debited in his books of account. So whatever event will be the earlier, we'll consider as the first event. And then the second event is immediately after the 60 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. So in case you are under the reverse charge mechanism and you are supplier or you are recipient of supply of goods, the second event was the 30 days, but in case of a service the event is the 60 days. So you have to consider the 60 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier in case you are the recipient of service under the GST and you are required to pay tax under the reverse charge mechanism. The next question is about the time of supply of goods as well as service in case there is a change in the rate of tax. So suppose you are paying the tax as per the normal rate up to a certain point of time, and suddenly the rate of tax under the GST has been changed with effect from that date. Then the question is, what will be the time of supply of goods as well as service in case there is a change in rate of tax? So before let's say that the time of supply of goods or services is before the change in the tax rate, then you have to pay the tax as per the existing rate. But if suppose the time of supply of goods or services is after the change in the tax rate, then you have to pay the tax under the new rate. So it is very important that how to determine the time of supply of goods or services in case there is a change in the rate of tax. So the question is how to determine the time of supply of goods or services in case of a change in the rate of tax. So if suppose there is a change in the rate of tax, then forget about the section 12 and the section 13. You don't have to look at the section 12 and the 13 when there is a change in the rate of tax. You have to follow section number 14, and section 14 says that notwithstanding with anything contained in section 12 or the 13, you don't have to look at the provision of 12 and 13 in case there is a change in rate of tax. So if there is a change in rate of tax, then there is a two circumstances which section 40 says. And the first situation or the circumstances is when the goods or services has been supplied before the change in the rate of tax. So the first situation is when the goods or services has been supplied before the change in rate of tax, and the second situation is when the goods or services has been supplied after the change in rate of tax. So when you supplied the goods or services before, when you supply the goods or services before the change in rate of tax, then you will have to consider this provision. And if suppose you supplied the goods or services after the change in tax of rate, then we will discuss about that in the next clip. So first of all, first situation, when you supply the goods or services before the change in tax of tax rate, then you have to also look at the three situation. In the first situation also there is also three sub situation. So the first sub situation is when you issue the invoice and you receive the payment in respect of supply of goods or services after the change in rate of tax. So when you supplied the goods or services before the change in tax rate, but you issued the invoice or you received the payment after change in the rate of tax, then how to determine the time of supply of goods or services in this case? The time of supply of goods or services in this case will be the earlier of the date of issue of invoice or the date of issue of invoice or when you receive the payment into your bank account. So the earlier of the date of issue of invoice or the date when you receive the payment will be the time of supply of goods or services in case there is a change in rate of tax. And the second sub situation is when you issued the invoice before the change in rate of tax, but you receive the payment after change in rate. So when you issued the invoice before changes and you receive the payment after changes, then the time of supply of goods or services will be the date of issue of invoice, the date of issue of invoice which is before the change in tax rate. And in the third sub situation, when you receive the payment before the change in rate of tax and you issued the invoice after the change in rate of tax, then the time of supply of goods or services in this case will be the date of receipt of payment, when the payment is before the change in rate of tax. So if you are supplying the goods or services before the change in rate of tax, there are three sub situations. The first sub situation is when the invoice and the payment is received after the change in tax rate, then the time of supply of goods or services in this case will be the earlier of the date of issue of invoice or the receiving of payment in respect of those supply of goods or service. And in the second sub situation, when you issue the invoice before the change in rate of tax and when you receive the payment after the change in rate of tax, then in this case the time of supply of goods or services will be the date of issue of invoice which is before the change in rate of tax. And in the third sub situation, when you receive the payment before the change in rate of tax and you issue the invoice after the change in rate of tax, then the time of supply of goods or services in this case will be the date of receipt of payment which is when you receive the payment before the change in rate of tax. And the second situation is when the goods or services has been supplied after the change in the effective rate of tax. So in the previous clip we have learned that how to determine the time of supply of goods or services in case the goods or services has been supplied before the change in rate of tax. Now we should look at how to determine the time of supply of goods or services in case you supply the goods or services after the change in effective rate of tax, change in the rate of tax. So there are also three subsections under this section also. So the first subsection is where you issue the invoice and you receive the payment before the change in the rate of tax. In this situation, the time of supply of goods or services will be the earlier of the date of issue of invoice and the date of receiving the payment. And in the second subsection or the second sub-situation is that when you issue the invoice after the change in the rate of tax and you make the payment before the change in the rate of tax. In that case, the time of supply of goods or services will be the date of issue of invoice which is after the change in the rate of tax. And in the third sub-situation where you receive the payment after change in the rate of tax but you issue the invoice before change in the rate of tax. In that situation, the time of supply of goods or services will be the date of receipt of payment, which is after the change in rate of tax. So there are three sub situations. In the situation where the goods or services is supplied after the change in rate of tax, in the first sub situation where you issue the invoice and you receive the payment after the change in effective rate of tax, then you issued the invoice and you receive the payment before the change in rate of tax. In that situation, the time of supply of goods or services will be the earlier of the two events. First event is that when you issue the invoice, and the second event is when you receive the payment by the supplier. And in the second sub situation, when you issue the invoice after the change in rate of tax, but you receive the payment before the change in rate of tax, then in this case the time of supply of goods or services will be the date of issue of invoice, which is after the change in rate of tax. And in the third sub situation where you make the payment after the change in rate of tax, but you receive the invoice before the change in rate of tax, then the time of supply of goods or services will be the date of receipt of payment, which is after the change in rate of tax. Now we should look that when the supplier can say that he receives the payment in respect of supply of goods or services. So the date of receipt of payment in respect of the supply of goods or services will be the earlier of the following two events. First event is that when the supplier make the entry in his books of account, and the second event is when the amount will be credited into his bank account. So the date of receipt of payment in respect of supply of goods or services by the supplier will be the earlier of the two events. First event is when he makes the entry in his books of account, or when the amount will be credited into his bank account. So the date when he makes the entry in his books of account means the date when he make the entry into his books of account, like when he debit the bank account and credit the debtors. So that will be considered as the date of making the entry in his books of account. But don't you see, or don't you feel that the supplier of goods or services can manipulate the date of entry in his books of account to save the tax? Don't you think that he can manipulate the date of entry in his books of account in his favor? So suppose there is a change in rate of tax from 12% to 18%. So he can manipulate the payment of tax by way of showing the entry in his books of account earlier than the change in rate of tax, so that he can pay the less tax. Don't you think that? If you are still confused, then let me give you an example that how he can manipulate the change in the rate of tax, or how he can manipulate the date of entry in his books of account so that he has to pay, or he ended up paying the less tax. Let me give an example that how he can manipulate the date of entry in his books of account in his favor. So we know that according to the law, if the supplier supply the goods or services before the change in effective rate of tax, if supplier supply the goods or services before the change in effective rate of tax, and when the invoice is issued after the change in effective rate of tax, and the payment is received before the change in effective rate of tax, then the time of supply of goods or services will be the date of receiving the payment in the bank account, the date of receiving the payment by the supplier. So we know this is a law. We know that this is the fact that if the supplier supply the goods or services before the change in effective rate of tax, and when he issue the invoice after change in effective rate of tax, but he receives the payment in respect of those supplied before the change in effective rate of tax, then the time of supply of goods or services will be the date of receipt of payment, which will be before the change in effective rate of tax. We know this is a law, and I'm going to show you that how he can manipulate the book entry into his favor so that he ended up paying the less tax. So suppose we are taking the example that there is a change in rate of tax with effect from the 8th August 2017, and the effective rate of tax has now become 18% from 12%. So before 8th August 2017 the rate of tax was 12%, and now it has become the 18%. Make or remember the change in effective rate of tax in our example, because that will be very important. The rate will be changed from 12% to 18% with effect from 8th August 2017. So suppose in our example the date of issue of invoice is 10th August 2017, which is after the change in effective rate of tax, and the date of entry in the books of account by the supplier is 7th August 2017, which is before change in effective rate of tax, and the date of credit in the bank account is 20th August 2017, which is after the change in effective rate of tax. So firstly we have to consider those two situations, and we know the law that the date of receipt of payment is the earlier of the date of entry in his books of account and the date when the amount is credited into his bank account. So the earlier event is 7th August 2017. The earlier event is 7th August 2017, and the 7th August 2017 is before the change in effective rate of tax. Now the situation is the payment, when he received the payment, is before the change in effective rate of tax, and the date of issue of invoice is after, because the date of issue of invoice was 10th August 2017, or it is after change in effective rate of tax. So according to the law, the time of supply of goods or services will be the receipt of payment, and the receipt of payment is 7th August 2017, which is earlier of when he make the entry in the books of account or when the amount is credited in the bank account. So earlier event is 7th August 2017. So what was the effective rate of tax on 7th August 2017? The effective rate of tax was 12%. So instead of paying 18%, he ended up paying 12%, just by way of making the books entry before the change in rate of tax, because he know that the earlier event out of those two events will be always the date when he makes the books entry into his books of account. So he can manipulate that books entry in his favor. So if suppose the change in effective rate of tax has been increased, so he just have to make the entry before the change in effective rate of tax so that he can pay the less tax. But for plugging or for taking care such a situation or such a manipulation, the law itself provide the time. The law provide the date of receipt of payment in case the person receives the payment after the 4 working days from the date of change in effective rate of tax. And the law provides that is the exact wording of the law, that provided that the date of receipt of payment shall be the date of credit in the bank account if such credit in the bank account is after 4 working days from the date of change in the rate of tax. So if the date of credit in the bank account will be after the 4 working days from the date of change in effective rate of tax, then the date of receipt of payment by the supplier will be considered as the date on which the amount will be credited into his bank account. So in our situation, because there is change in effective rate of tax with effect from 8th August 2017 and the amount is credited into his bank account on 20th August 2017. Now we know, according to rule, when there is a change in effective rate of tax and when the amount is credited after 4 working days from the date of effective rate of change, then the date of receipt of payment by the supplier will be the date when the amount will be credited into his bank account. So in our example, the entry in the books of account was on 7th August 2017 and the date in his credit in the bank account was 20th August 2017, which was after the 4 working days from the date of effective change. Then in our example we will ignore that one and we will consider the date of receipt of payment as 20th August 2070. So that will be considered as the date of receipt of payment. Now the date of receipt of payment is 20th August 2017, which is after the change in effective rate of tax. So now after the change in effective rate of tax it has considered, and we know the law that when the goods will be supplied before the change in effective rate of tax and both the invoice and payment is received after the change in effective rate of tax, then the time of supply goods or services will be not receipt of payment but earlier of invoice and payment. So now the law has changed, and the date of making the payment, the date of the time of issue, the time of supply of goods or services will be the earlier of issuing the invoice and the making the receipt of payment. So the receipt of payment is 20th August 2017 and the date of issue of invoice is 10th August 2017, which is both the situation, the invoice and the receiving the payment is after the change in rate of tax. Therefore the law says that in such situation the time of supply goods or service will be earlier of the two event, and the earlier of the two event is 10th August 2017. And what is the rate of tax on 10th August 2017? 18%. So before we didn't know the fact that if the amount will be credited after 4 working days from the date of change in effective rate of tax, the situation was very different. He ended up paying the 12%. But after we know that if the amount will be credited after the 4 working days from a change in effective tax, now the situation is opposite. He ended up paying the 18%. So therefore, to plug in or to take care such a situation where the supplier can manipulate the entry in his books of account, the law come up with a solution, and it says that the date of receipt of payment will be different. The date of receipt of payment will not be the earlier of making the book entry or amount created in the bank account. In case the change in effective rate of tax, then the date of receipt of payment by the supplier will be the date when the amount will be credited into bank account if the amount will be credited after the 4 working days from the change from the date when there is a change in effective rate of tax. So when there is a change in effective rate of tax and when the amount is credited into bank account after 4 working days from the date of change in effective rate of tax, and in those cases the date of receipt of payment by the supplier will be considered as the date when the amount will be credited into his bank account. Therefore the law provides for such a situation. The law plug those situations in which the supplier can manipulate the date of entry in his books of account and therefore ended up paying a lower rate of taxes. And this is our last question. With this we will wrap it up, and the question is relating to the time of supply of goods or services in case of the delay payment of consideration, in case the late fees, interest, penalty, etc. for delay payment of consideration. And the question is, what is the time of supply applicable with regard to the addition in the value by way of interest, late fee or penalty or any delay payment of consideration? So how the time of supply will be determined in case of a penalty, late fee or any other kind of stuff for delay payment of consideration when the supplier charge from recipient of goods or services. Is there any other section which deals with such a situation? So the answer is yes. The section 12 subsection 6 and section 13 subsection 6, which is with regard to the supply of goods or the supply of service respectively, deals with such a situation where the supplier of goods or services charge in addition to the value of supply of goods or services interest, late fee, penalty or any other consideration for delay payment of the consideration. So the law says that the time of supply, to the extent it relates to the addition in the value of supply by way of. So if you are a supplier and you are adding if you are adding those kind of stuffs to the extent it relate to those kind of stuffs like interest, late fee, penalty, then the time of supply of those case will be when the supplier receives the such consideration. So when you charging the interest, late fees, penalty for delay payment of the consideration, when you charge the interest, penalty or the late fees for delay payment of the consideration and you're charging it from the recipient of supply of goods as well as for services, then the time of supply in those cases will be when the supplier receives such addition. But that the time of supply of those cases will be only to the extent it relate to interest, late fee or penalty. So suppose you issue an invoice of 2000 rupees and the recipient of supply of goods or services didn't make the payment up to the certain point of time and you charge the late fees of only 100 rupees, then the time of supply of that penalty will be the date when he received the such consideration, when he received the such addition, and that will be only for 100 rupees, not the whole amount of money, but only to the extent the addition in value of supply by way of only those kind of stuffs. So only to the extent it relates to the addition of interest, penalty or late fees, only for that portion the time of supply of that portion will be the time when he receives such additions. Alright guys, so thanks for watching this lengthy video. This is the lengthy video we have ever made. So thanks for watching the video and make sure that you subscribe my channel because there will be more Q&A in this channel. So stick to the channel and subscribe by clicking the subscribe button which is just down below the video. And if you like it, then share this video to those one who don't know about the GST and wanted to eagerly know about the GST. The link of all of the videos which I have referred in this video is also given down in the description column which is just below the video. Make sure that you click on the link and enjoy the education which I am providing to you at the free of cost. And also you can ask your query by sending an email to sharwangst.148@gmail.com sharwangst.148@gmail.com. So with this we will end this topic or this video and we will again meet in the next video. Till then, bye bye.